Okay, so we're obviously in the parsha of the actual Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus in Parshat Bo, and Perek Yud Beis, chapter 12 of Sefer Shmos. We find that the Jewish people are given a number of commandments that they are supposed to observe the Seder night, the night before they leave. They're going to leave the morning of the 15th of Nisan, and they were commanded on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, 2 weeks earlier, to involve themselves in many commandments, such as the Korban Pesach, putting the blood on the doorways and on the lintel, the eating of Matzah, the eating of Maror, and these are mitzvot that have continued every year. So I want to focus really on a statement that's in the Haggadah of Pesach that is taken from a Mishnah. Rabbi Gamliel Haya Omer. Rabbi Gamliel used to say, "Kol mi shaloi amar shlosha devarim halalu bepesach." Anyone who does not explain three things connected to Pesach, lo yatsa yedei chovaso, has not fulfilled his obligation. And those three things are Korban Pesach, why we eat the Korban Pesach; Matzah, why we eat Matzah; and Maror, why we eat Maror. Now, let's focus on the first part of the sentence. Whoever does not explain these three things has not fulfilled his obligation. Which obligation have they not fulfilled? So the commentaries say right off the bat, it does not mean the obligation of Pesach Matzah Maror, the obligation of eating the Korban Pesach, the obligation of eating the Matzah, the obligation of eating the Maror. You fulfill those obligations by eating. You don't have to explain, just like, for example, you fulfill Lulav and Esrog, you don't have to explain anything. So when it says, Lo Yatsa Yedei Chayvasai, it does not refer to those mitzvahs. It refers to the mitzvah of narration. There is a mitzvah the night of Pesach to discuss the Exodus. So part of what you must do is explain the symbolic meaning of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. So the question is, why is that so important? I mean, one would have thought that the story of the Exodus is simply the story of God taking us out of Egypt. Why is it so important to explain the symbolism of the foods that we eat? And indeed, what is the symbolism of those foods that we eat? Of course, today we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. We are not yet zocheh to bring the Korban Pesach. We hope and we pray that already this coming Pesach we will have the opportunity to bring the Korban Pesach. But nevertheless, just as we say with davening, U'neshalma parim sefasenu, that when we talk about what we don't have, God credits it as if we have the Korban. That is certainly true with the Korban Pesach itself. So here, I have to go back to a point that I think I made a number of times already, and that is, let's take another statement in the Haggadah. Chayav adam liras asatzmo. A person must regard themselves as if they themselves were taken out of Egypt. And the question becomes, how is that true? I was never in Egypt. In what way can it be said, I must regard myself as if I was taken out of Egypt? So I think I mentioned to you two different explanations. One is the Rambam, and one is the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. The Rambam says that the din of Chayav Adam Liros Asatzmo Kilu Yatzim Mitzrayim is a matter of what you might call imaginative visualization, or even method acting, if you want to be a little flippant about it. And that is, the Rambam makes the point that in order to fully appreciate the meaning of an experience, you sometimes need to visualize and imagine going through it. So in order for me to be appreciative of God redeeming our forefathers from Egypt, I need to imagine what it was like to be a slave. I need to imagine the whipping, the abuse, the punishment, the backbreaking labor, the humiliation, the lack of privacy. And by, just like a method actor, by putting myself in the emotions of that moment, by visualization, by imagination, I am able to transpose myself to that moment in time, and then I can relive or experience, even for the first time, the fullness of that moment and the greatness of the freedom and liberation that God has given us. Which means, according to the Rambam, the statement that each person must regard themselves as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim is not a truthful statement. It is frankly a make-believe statement, but it's designed to facilitate feelings of gratitude and emotional connection to that experience. That is the Rambam, and indeed it's something that we sometimes don't always emphasize in Torah Judaism. The power of imagination, the power of visualization. In my shared Rabbi Wines, we used to give a shir about the Piazetzner Rebbe, the Eish Kodesh, the last Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he talks quite a lot about the idea of visualization. This was actually one of his Hasidic themes, including visualizing the day of your death, in terms of trying to feel what are going to be your regrets when you leave the world. And, somewhat daringly, he even talks about visualization of the Almighty, with the recognition that that's not a true visualization, but he says if it helps a person in davening to visualize a man with a long white beard embracing him, he is permitted to engage even in that type of visualization, because that could bring him to an emotional state of inner dveikut, cleaving. Now, of course, there you have the caveat that he must understand that this is not a true picture, but this is a means of arousing certain emotions. Obviously, that particular visualization was quite controversial, and I hasten to add, the Rambam would almost certainly, I could say with certainty, would disassociate from that type of visualization, because if you know the general philosophy of the Rambam was a warrior against any type of anthropomorphic conception, any type of human-like conception of God. I mean, essentially, if we had to summarize in one sentence why the Rambam wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, although there are many, many themes in the Guide to the Perplexed, the number one theme of the Guide to the Perplexed is the lack of physicality and corporality in the nature and the essence of God. Now, that does raise important questions, but they're peripheral to my topic tonight. That's the old idea of, on one hand, the Rambam makes the point, and this is kind of a cornerstone of Jewish belief, that God does not have a body. On the other hand, if we posit God cannot have a body by his very nature, we run into the difficult questions of God's omnipotence. If God can do whatever he wants, then why can't God have a body if he so desires? Those are, famous questions, difficult questions. Along the lines: can God commit suicide? Can God make an object that he can't move, etc.? That's always a problem. In other words, anything that defines God could be seen as a form of limitation of God, and that runs head-on into a collision course with the notion of omnipotence, that there's nothing that God cannot do. Again, interesting question. I'm not going to talk about that question tonight, but I'm just bringing it in because the Rambam does employ visualization and imagination, not in imagining God as a physical being. He does not go as far as the Piazetzner Rebbe of Colonimus Kalman Shapiro, but that's how he understands you must regard yourself as if you were in Mitzrayim. Imagine what it is like to be a slave. Again, those of you that are familiar with Lee Strasberg and Marlon Brando and method acting understand that that is what a method actor does. He kind of imagines himself to be in that experience. Pshat number 2 is from the Baal HaTanya, and this is not a contradiction, but it's another perspective, that Mitzrayim does not mean Egypt at all. Mitzrayim means limitations, constrictions, blockages. And seen in that way, every person has a Mitzrayim, an inner Mitzrayim. And that inner Mitzrayim is something that enslaves me from within. It blocks me. It constricts me. It could be my egotism. It could be my arrogance. It could be my selfishness, my laziness, my lack of self-esteem, my lack of self-awareness, my inability to connect to others, my inability to love God, and the inability to even connect to my own inner feelings. All of this is blockage. All of this is Mitzrayim. And the Baal HaTanya says, when God redeemed the Jewish people from Mitzrayim, he put a power into the world that enables each and every one of us to become liberated from the inner Mitzrayim that enslaves us. So the statement, each person must regard himself as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, is not to be translated. Each person must make believe they were a slave in Egypt. But rather, each person must honestly recognize the inner Mitzrayim of their heart and recognize that by linking to the spiritual phenomenon of Yetzias Mitzrayim, they can achieve their own internal liberation from whatever it is that enslaves us. That's a very, very powerful idea, because what it tells us is that Yetzias Mitzrayim is not just a historical event, but it introduced into the world a certain process, a certain koach, a certain power that I can tap into. Now, the truth of the matter is that is consistent with the general understanding of time in Judaism. Sacred time is not linear. It is really cyclical. When we commemorate historical events, it's not simply there was an event and we are remembering it, but rather these events bring into the world spiritual energies. And when those days come again in the calendar cycle, those spiritual energies are reignited. They become present evermore, and I'm able to tap into those spiritual energies to achieve whatever it is I need. So Shavuot would be the koach of the Torah coming in. Sukkot is feeling the protective presence of God. Pesach is that about freedom from my inner Mitzrayim. I think I had mentioned on a Sunday, and again I apologize for people who go to more than one share of mine. Sometimes you'll hear some repetition, and I apologize for that. But as Rabbi Lopiansky says, a person eats his grandmother's chocolate cake more than once, and they don't complain. And that is that the largest Seder in the world is in Kathmandu. It used to be, at least. I'm not sure today. Chabad runs a Seder for more than 2,000 people. Most of whom I think are Israelis who are doing their traveling. There aren't that many native Jewish Nepalians in Nepal. And it's a 2,000 person Seder, huge Seder. It's quite amazing. Logistically, it's amazing. And how do you run a Seder that size without a microphone? I guess Rabbi Poston has maybe a smaller issue, but it's a similar issue, a big Seder and the like. And they have an interesting custom on Erev Pesach, when they burn their chametz. Everybody takes a piece of paper and writes down a bad character trait that they would like to destroy along with the chametz. And they burn that character trait with the chametz. Now you might hear that, and if you're a traditional Jew, you might say, oh, this avant-garde stuff, this is like hippie-ish from the 60s. This is not what a traditional Orthodox halachic Jew does. But in truth, it fits very much the idea that the burning of the chametz is also the burning away of all of those blockages within me that prevent me from connecting to God. And even though the actual physical idea of burning the paper might be a little new, but in fact there is a prayer that people recite. It's in Sidurim. When they burn the chametz, not everybody recites it, but the prayer says, just as I have merited to burn the physical leaven, may I merit to burn the Yetzer Hara that is within me. Again, Tashlich is very similar, although there you're using water instead of fire. People go to the river, go to the water on Rosh Hashanah, and they throw breadcrumbs into the water, and they say, based on a pasuk, Tashlich b'msulas yom kol chatasam, let us cast into the ocean, into the sea, all of our sins. And people may have an idea that somehow they're throwing their sins into the water. Well, repentance doesn't work that way. It's not that easy. You can't just transfer your sins to the crumbs and throw it into the water. But these are symbolic gestures that are reflective of internal processes that a person has to go through. So there we're using the symbol of throwing our sins into the water. By chametz, we're using the symbol of burning our sins. One can talk about why two metaphors, the metaphor of fire and the metaphor of water. But this is the idea that Yetzias Mitzrayim is the koach to be liberated from all of those enslavers that we have within. Selfishness, egotism, laziness, lack of self-esteem, whatever it is. So those are two explanations, and each person must regard themselves as if they have left Mitzrayim. We have the Rambam, imagination, visualization. We have the Baal HaTanya, the inner Mitzrayim that is within you. Now, we now come back to Rabbi Gamliel. Anyone that didn't explain three things, the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror, has not been Yotzei, his obligation of recounting the Exodus. If we follow the Baal HaTanya's paradigm, we might suggest that Pesach, Matzah, and Maror are various concretizations of steps that a person takes to be liberated from their own inner Mitzrayim. And therefore they too represent symbols. I'm going to go in reverse order, and I'll explain at the end why I'm going in reverse order. Let us first start with the idea of Maror. Right? There is a mitzvah that Leil Pesach we must eat something that is bitter, a bitter vegetable. Now, some people use horseradish, some people will use romaine lettuce, which has a slightly bitter tinge, so it doesn't have to be overly bitter, but there has to be some type of bitterness. And the purpose of eating bitterness is to remember that we were enslaved. How would that apply to the Baal HaTanya's paradigm? So the suggestion would be that the first step that is necessary to achieve spiritual liberation is the honest acknowledgement to yourself that you are in a state of slavery. If you live in a state of denial, you can never achieve liberation because you don't have the honesty to acknowledge that you're a slave. Now, in other words, I have to acknowledge that I need to work on something. I have to acknowledge my arrogance, my selfishness, my temper. If a relationship is not working, I have to be honest enough to look at it and look at me and see what is not working and what can I do about it. If you sweep things under the rug and you live in a state of denial, then eventually the rug gets higher and higher and higher till the pile of what you swept under the rug hits the ceiling, and then there's not a lot that you can go to. So Maror is the idea that in order to achieve freedom, you have to have the honesty and the courage to acknowledge slavery. And by the acknowledgement of that slavery, you have taken the first step to achieve freedom. That is why Maror is so essential as part of the freedom process. I remember when I first moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, and I was teaching at the University of Maryland Law School in Baltimore, which is north. So those of you that know the American highway system know that you have to go on a major highway, 95, and you go 95 north from Silver Spring, which is the Washington area, to Baltimore. So 95 north is the route. You go on automatic pilot and just go straight. But as you're driving, there is a turnoff to 95 south. So if you're in the right lane, you could very easily, as you're driving, find yourself 95 south. So in my early years, I was daydreaming or something, and I'm driving along, and all of a sudden I am passing the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. Those are not the things you see when you're going north to Baltimore. Those are the things that you see when you're going south towards Virginia. So all of a sudden I realized with dismay that I had never seen these things before. I mean, I had seen pictures of them, and oy vey, I must be going on the wrong road. But I did not want to admit I was going on the wrong road because I wasn't sure how to correct myself. So I was going through a mental process that I can't really explain, but I was trying to justify to myself, maybe I'm not lost. I said, maybe you can see these things from 95 north, just you never noticed it before. Now maybe you're going the right way. Or maybe if I just keep on going, somehow it will correct itself. This is innumerable situation of many investors. This is the idea of what? Throwing good money after bad. You invest $1,000, the business fails, you keep on putting it in. And of course we know, as Albert Einstein famously remarked, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get a different results, but this is what life is, because we just don't want to acknowledge that we have to make a change. It's hard to make a change, so we continue to go in the same way with a kind of immature, magical thinking that somehow it's just going to get better. Now, in my case, it is true that if I would go all the way to Florida, all the way to Key West, Florida, indeed, 95 South ends, and you just make a little U-turn, and you can go north. So I could have kept on going, but I would have been late for class. That would have taken quite a few hours of driving. And the very first step to finding my way was honestly acknowledging that I've lost my way. And that is what Maror is. Recognize the slavery. Be strong enough, be honest enough to understand when you need to address a situation. And that is what Maror is as part of our journey. We then come to Matzah. Now, this is a very interesting question. Why do we eat Matzah on Pesach? What does Matzah symbolize? So it's very, very interesting that the Torah itself has two different accounts of why we eat Matzah, and it's a little ambiguous. On one level, Matzah is called Lechem Oni, the bread of poverty, the bread of affliction, the bread of deprivation. Seen in that light, Matzah is a slavery symbol. The Ibn Ezra points out that when he was a traveler, the Ibn Ezra was a world traveler, and he mentions that when he was in India and he saw the slaves that the Maharajis had, they would commonly feed them matzah, because matzah stays in your digestive system a very long time, and therefore there's less of a need to eat that much matzah. So matzah was the slave food that the Jewish people were given in Mitzrayim, and therefore matzah, like Maror, is a commemoration of slavery. On the other hand, we have another account of matzah, which is a totally different account, that matzah is the food of redemption. Because what was it? When the Jews were baking their bread on the way out of Egypt, they did not have time to let their dough rise and ferment. Why didn't they have time? So the simple meaning is because Paro and the Egyptians were telling them, get out. Kabbalistically, the interpretation is that the Jewish people were on the 49th level of impurity, and had they stayed even the little amount of time that it takes for the dough to ferment, they would have hit the 50th level. So whether it means the Egyptians didn't give them time, or whether it means God didn't give their time, we had to bake our bread in haste. We had to bake our bread without giving it the time to rise. This is called in the Torah chipazon. Chipazon is in a state of hurriedness, to be rushed, not completing what we needed to do. And therefore when we eat matzah, it is a commemoration of the Geulah, the redemption that took place in a state of hurriedness. So you understand these are two opposite reasons, meaning matzah as a symbol of slavery, which is lechem oni, and matzah as a symbol of redemption, which is lo hispik b'tseikam shel avaseinu lahachmitz. There was no time for our dough to rise. And that is why the Haggadah reflects both of those motifs. In the beginning of the Haggadah we say in Aramaic, ha lachma anya, this is the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in Mitzrayim. And then at the end of the Haggadah we mention Rabbi Gamliel, who brings in lo hispik b'tseikam shel avaseinu lahachmitz. Our forefathers did not have time to let their dough rise. That Geulat Mitzrayim was in a state of chipazon. By the way, that itself is some very deep significance, because the commentaries tell us that because we left b'chipazon, we did not complete the process, and that is why we need golus. Ad hayom hazeh, had we not left b'chipazon, had we completed the process, that would have been the ultimate tikkun, the ultimate rectification, and there would have been no need for a later golus. Right, so these are two motifs in matzah. There's the matzah of freedom, the matzah of slavery, but the Maral brings another perspective, a new perspective, to the idea of matzah. And that is The difference between matzah and chametz, right? Chametz on Pesach is bad, and matzah on Pesach is good. We eat matzah, we don't eat chametz. Now, it's a very familiar idea that chametz represents arrogance and conceit, puffed up, and matzah represents simplicity and humility. That's a well-known idea. But Maror adds another perspective, and he says that chametz represents inertia, and matzah represents constructive action. Because here's the thing, when water falls on flour, you don't need to do anything for it to become chametz. If you simply leave it alone for 18 minutes, unbaked, it will become chametz. You don't need yeast. You don't need a starter. Chametz, as the halakha defines it, is a process that will occur automatically if the dough is left undisturbed for 18 minutes before it's baked. That's why in conscientious matzah factories, they clean the machinery within every 18 minutes, meaning they'll stop production because in case there might be pieces of dough that were not fully baked, and if it was there for 18 minutes, it would turn into chametz and it might contaminate the other matzot. Again, once it's baked, there's no problem. In fact, this is the source of the Hasidic custom some of you might have of not eating gebruxt, or in Hebrew, not eating shuruya. Right? There are many Hasidim that have a custom. They will not eat any matzah or matzah meal that was soaked in liquid. Dietary restrictions. They cannot have knedlach. They cannot have matzah balls on Pesach, because matzah balls would involve cooking matzah meal in soup or boiling them in water. And halachically that's not a problem, because once something is baked, it cannot be chametz anymore. But the minhag of not eating shruya was based on a concern that perhaps it was not completely baked, and therefore the contact with water could cause. This is actually a chumrah that started with the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, and it spread among all Hasidim. In fact, there's a fellow who wrote a book. This is a tremendously funny book. Zev Magen. Zev Magen is a professor of Islamic studies, I think, at Bar Ilan. No?
Shalom College.
Oh, he retired? Okay, he wasn't Bar Ilan. When he wrote the book, I think it was Bar Ilan. But Zev Magen wrote a tremendous book about John Lennon and the Jews. I don't know if it's a crazy thing. Basically, this was a critique of Lennon's song Imagine, right? One of John Lennon's songs is, imagine a world when you don't have separate nations, you don't have separate religions, you don't have all the things that divide you, and we're one big happy family and we're united. Why do we have to live in a world of divisions? And Zev Magen wrote the book to basically say, you cannot have a love of humanity unless it first starts with particularized attachments. The parent who does not love their child cannot really develop love and compassion for others, and therefore you need particularism in order to move to universalism. Now that sounds ponderous and heavy, but I can tell you the book is hilarious. It is funny, and it's filled with all sorts of crazy stories. So he tells the story, I guess at some point he wasn't that orthodox, or he wasn't familiar with this, that he's invited, that he says he looked forward the whole year to matzah ball soup by the Seder. So he's invited to a friend's Seder, and the Haggadah is very long, a lot of commentaries, his stomach is growling, he's really dreaming of the matzah ball soup. And finally, the great moment arrives. You know, they finished the Haggadah, and they ate the matzah, and they ate the Maror, and they ate the korach sandwich. And he smells the soup, the aroma of the chicken soup, wafting from the kitchen. And all of a sudden they bring him a bowl, and all there is soup. There's like nothing in it. So he says, did you forget something here? He says, no, everything's fine. So what he does he figures that he doesn't know what happened, so he just takes his own matzah and he crushes it into the soup. So he says, all of a sudden there's a shriek. And the woman dives, he describes, the woman dives across the table, takes the tureen of soup, or takes the bowl of soup, and she throws it they're on the 4th floor. She throws it off the Marpesach. He doesn't know what's going on. He says, all I wanted was matzah ball. So the person said, you can have matzah balls the rest of the year, not on Pesach. Because this was his introduction to the minhag of not eating shruya. But in terms of halacha, it's very, very clear that something can become chametz only when it's in an unbaked state. So says the Maral, therefore, chametz is the paradigm of inertia, not doing anything. To make chametz happens. Matzah takes decisive action in arresting the fermentation process by exposing the dough to heat. And therefore the Maral says, instead of just looking at the idea that chametz is arrogance and matzah is humility, which is true, chametz represents inertia and matzah represents action. And the reason that's significant is the following. Maror gives me the cognitive awareness that I have problems. But matzah is the imperative of doing something about it. You know, there are people who go to psychoanalysis and they have perhaps a very deep insight into all of the traumas that they've suffered through life, going all the way back to birth and maybe even pre-birth trauma and even preconception trauma, you know, who knows, they go all the way back, etc. And they understand the significance of every negative interaction that ever occurred in their lives. But the question becomes, what are you going to do about it, right? That might be the difference sometimes between a Freudian analyst and a behavioral therapist. Freud emphasized the importance of insight and understanding, but that didn't always translate into concrete attempts to deal with something. So the lesson of Matzah is that it is not enough to be aware of what the issue is. You then have to take some decisive action to address it. You know, there was an American academic, Robert Hutchins, who was kind of a prodigy. In fact, there used to be a program called the Great Books Program, which is kind of exposing you to all of the classics of world literature, particularly Western philosophical tradition. And he was the editor or the spearheader of that huge project. And he was kind of a boy wonder. He became president of the University of Chicago at the age of 25, which is quite amazing. He had many graduate students who were older than him, and yet he was really a kind of a prodigy. And at one point he was asked, why didn't he take better physical care of himself? They said, Dr. Hutchins, do you ever feel the urge to exercise? So he said, I certainly feel that urge, but whenever it bothers me too much, I know if I lie down for a few minutes, the urge will go away. So I don't let it bother me too much. And the truth of the matter is that's very true with respect to exercise, but it's also true with respect to spirituality. There are times in life when we do feel deep spiritual arousal and inspiration. It may be after Yom Kippur, it may be after a Pesach Seder, it may be when a child or a grandchild gets married. It may be walking in a sunset in Yerushalayim or seeing children play in a park. Everyone has different moments of inspiration. And those are wonderful moments. Those are moments that one treasures. But you have to know that if you don't concretize the feeling in some constructive action, the emotion dissipates. It goes away very, very quickly. You have to anchor it, even in a small, relatively minor action. Do something. It then becomes concretized, it then becomes real, and it can then become the basis that will bring you to more levels based on Chazal's teaching. Mitzvah gereris mitzvah, that one mitzvah causes other mitzvahs, and the like. So one needs to take whatever inspiration you have and do something about it. That is what matzah is. Take some action. Take something that you put into practice because of that particular feeling or inspiration. And that's a very important yesod. So if Maror is the idea of cognitively identifying what my slavery is, Matzah represents the importance of decisive, concretized action, so that the feeling doesn't just become ephemeral, temporary, washed away, but the foundation of your spiritual growth as a Jew and as a human being. Right, so that's the juxtaposition of Maror and Matzah. We then come to Pesach, and again, this is reverse order, but I will go back why we are doing it in this order. The Korban Pesach, of course, was a korban that all of the Jewish people had to bring. And there are many, many halachas of the Korban Pesach. But one very interesting halacha of the Korban Pesach is you cannot bring the Korban Pesach as an individual. You must bring the Korban Pesach as part of a group. So I either bring it with my family, or if I do not have a family, I attach myself to other people, and that's called chabura. I become part of a chabura, and I bring the Korban Pesach as part of a chabura. Even if I have a very big appetite, and even if I am bringing a very small lamb, the lamb only has to be 8 days old, and it's kosher for a Korban Pesach, so it could be a very small thing. I could finish the whole thing myself. The halacha is, it's a machlokas in the Gemara, but we paskin, ein shochtin es ha-pesach al ha-yochid. A yochid, an individual, cannot bring the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach has to be an expression of being connected to a community, whether it's the community of your own personal family, or whether it's a community of your adopted family, the family of people with whom you identify. What's the spiritual lesson here? The spiritual lesson here is that when we have to leave the Mitzrayim that enslaves us, we cannot do so as isolated individuals. We need to connect ourselves to others who want to go on that same journey. Now, everybody's journey is a little different, because my slavery is not your slavery. But I need the chizuk and the strength that I get from others. And I also need to be a person that gives others that strength. I grow from what I receive, and I grow from what I contribute. And I need it. I need others, and others need me. And the Pesach is that lesson of what we would call conscious community, of connecting yourself to others. Find people in life that want to go on that journey with you, because we can't do it alone. Shlomo HaMelech says in Koheles, Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad. Two people are better than one, because if one person falls, who will pick him up? When you have two people and one falls, ha'echad yakim et chaveiro, one person can raise the other person. And then Shlomo HaMelech goes on and says, hachut ha'meshulash, if it's a threefold cord, lo b'meheira yinatek, it's not that easy to pull it apart. Now, this is not only referring to slipping on the ice, although that's true as well. If, God forbid, somebody slips on the ice, it's a lot easier to get up if somebody is there to pick you up, especially as we get a little older. But it refers to life in general. All of us have moments of weakness. All of us have moments where we're afraid, where we're uncertain, where we're confused, where we don't really have a sense of where we're supposed to be going. Or sometimes we might feel trapped in a situation which we don't know how to get out of. There are many, many quandaries that people face. And if you're all by yourself in life, it's going to be very hard to navigate it. So you find connections. We need to find connections. Ideally, one has that in their immediate family, their parents, their spouses. Sometimes a person doesn't have that opportunity. Either, they're not married, they don't have parents, their parents died, whatever it would be, or even if they have a technical relationship, it may not necessarily address those particular needs. So we need to find virtual families. And by a virtual family, I don't mean to say virtual in the sense of an internet thing. I'm talking about real human relationships. But they become our family. Many Olim have this experience. Unfortunately, when you make Aliyah, so one of the negatives, sometimes positive, but sometimes often negative, is that you are separated from your family and loved ones. Very hard. Now, today with technology, it's a little easier to keep the connection, but still, you're thousands of miles away. And what people do is, what you have to do is, you have to kind of find a little bit of a virtual family. And many people suffer. The people who don't do that suffer a lot. They do suffer a tremendous amount. Because as we're so proud of being self-sufficient, that we look at it as a sign of weakness to have to reach out and connect to others. But we have to know that we need others, and even more importantly, others need us as well. So even if you think you don't need other people, okay, that's fine. You don't need other people. Other people need you. What are you going to say about that? Right? I think I mentioned before, and again, forgive the repetition. Many of you have heard of the legendary conductor Arturo Toscanini, who again was a musical prodigy, a very, very brilliant and tremendously talented musician. Somebody from a magazine wanted to interview him, and Toscanini said, I'm really not available for interviewing because I'm not feeling well, and I'm sitting at home and my orchestra is playing a concert tonight, and I need to listen on radio so I could follow if they're doing the correct job. So the reporter said to Toscanini, I promise I won't say a word, I just want to watch you at work. So he comes to Toscanini's apartment in Manhattan, and Toscanini had, goes back to the 1950s, he had this old-fashioned, those gigantic radios, those big radios, and he's listening. This was actually it's interesting, Toscanini was the conductor, I think, of the NBC orchestra, and that doesn't sound like that would be one of the great orchestras, but in the 50s it actually was a very, very distinguished symphony orchestra. And Toscanini is listening for 2 hours to this concert on a radio which didn't have the highest quality sound. And he has his eyes closed and he's listening for 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, Toscanini said, how come there were only 14 violins in the string section? There should have been 15. Where was the 15th violin? So the reporter couldn't believe this. You're listening to a concert on a radio, and you can tell the difference between 14 violins and 15 violins? This is not possible. So he went and he checked with the head violinist, the lead violinist, or the first violinist they call it, in the orchestra. He said, tell me, how many violinists did you have tonight? So the guy said, well, we normally have 15, but tonight we had 14 because right before the concert, the 15th guy called and said he wasn't feeling well. So I figured, who's going to notice the difference? So I just went with 14. So the reporter goes back to Toscanini and says, Nes Gadol Hashem, supernatural miracle. You're amazing. You're able to tell the difference. How could that be? No human being could have such a sensitive ear. And Toscanini said, listen, I know that most people who heard the concert, even most people who were in the audience, unless they were counting the strings, wouldn't know the difference. But when you're the conductor, you know that every person makes a difference. And I am attuned to the fact that every single person in that orchestra makes a difference, even if most people don't even know what that difference is. I know. So people say that this Toscanini story is a mashal for how God views each and every one of us. We make a difference. We matter. We're needed. We might think our absence in something doesn't really make a big difference. Well, maybe we're the 15th violinist, maybe we're the 360th violinist, maybe we're the 360,000th violinist. But Hashem knows that there's something we add. So the notion of community is interesting. It's a little paradoxical. I need what others give me, but I also have to understand that others need what I have to offer as well. That what I contribute is valuable. I learn and I give. I take and I give back. That is what Korban Pesach represents, the notion that in your journey from slavery to freedom, you need to be connected to others. Again, if I could put in a little plug for Yiboneh, which is our great sponsor of the Shiurim, that is one of the reasons why Yiboneh is so focused not only on the Torah context, but also the Chesed context. Because Chesed is how we grow, by giving to others and by doing with others, with whom we learn and with whom we give and we teach by the example of our lives. So Chesed is not only about the altruism of helping others, it's the vehicle of our own growth and our own self-transformation. So it turns out, therefore, going back to the very beginning of our talk, Rabbi Gamliel's statement that you have to explain Pesach, Matzah, and Maror is really an elaboration of the Baal HaTanya's idea that every person has an inner Mitzrayim, and because of my inner Mitzrayim, I need to free myself from the slavery within. Pesach, Matzah, and Maror are the three steps that we need to achieve that personal liberation. Maror is the honesty to acknowledge my flaws and my failings. Taste the slavery. Matzah, recognize the imperative of constructive action. Pesach, find the community with whom you can take that journey. Because by yourself, it's going to be hard. We need each other, both for what they give us and for what we give them. Now, the final question, though, is you might question the order. Let's look at the Seder. In the Seder, we first eat matzah, and then we eat maror. And then we have the sandwich of the matzah and the maror. Now, you might say, based on the explanation that we've been giving, the order is incorrect, because if maror represents the honesty in identifying my struggles, and matzah is taking the corrective action to make things better, one might assume you can't really eat the matzah until you have the maror, meaning until you know what you need to correct, you can't automatically correct it. So logically, one might assume it would make more sense to eat the maror and then eat the matzah. And yet we eat the matzah and then the maror. So the truth of the matter is, I don't want to get into too much of a technical discussion, but according to Rashi's opinion, the way Rashi understands the whole Seder, the matzah that you eat first is not the mitzvah of matzah. It is the hamotzi, you're beginning a meal. The mitzvah of matzah is actually fulfilled with the afikomen that you eat at the end. So in terms of Rashi's opinion, the ritual order in terms of the mitzvot is I'm first eating the maror and then eating the matzah, and the matzah I ate before the maror is simply the beginning of a meal. Now, the obvious question on Rashi is, so why do you make the bracha on that first matzah, asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav etzvanu ala chilas matzah, if it's only a hamotzi function? That's a strong question, but at least according to Rashi, the issue of matzah preceding maror is not a problem, because according to Rashi, it is maror that is preceding matzah. But according to our practice, that we also fulfill the mitzvah of matzah first, you're back to the question, how can I eat matzah before maror? So here is the suggestion that I would say, and that is, although it's true that in my spiritual life I cannot rectify a problem until I'm aware of what the problem is, I must internalize my ability to rectify before I focus on the negative. Because here is the issue. If I immediately start focusing on my failures, on my shortcomings, on my mistakes, on my maror, on my slavery, What might happen is I get depressed, I get despondent, I lose hope, I have a sense that there's so much that I need to correct that I'm beyond the point of no return. So, before I embark on the process of identifying my negatives, I must internalize, I must convince myself, I must be persuaded of my capacity for constructive change. And that's the matzah. So, although it's true that the actual business of the matzah, corrective action, cannot be undertaken till after the Maror, identification of problem, but the capacity to take that corrective action must be an idea that I internalize within my psyche before I can confront the negatives. I cannot and I should not confront my negatives until I am convinced that I have the inner strength and capacity to address them in a successful and constructive way. So yes, you're not going to do the matzah work until after you do the Maror work, but the matzah is the first idea you have to internalize, because it's the matzah that gives you confidence, it gives you strength, it gives you a sense that you will be able to accomplish what it is that you need to accomplish. And that is why the matzah convinces me of my capacity for constructive action. The Maror is the cognitive awareness of what it is I need to correct. And then I eat the matzah and the Maror together, which is integrating the problem with the solution, so to speak. I eat them together. I have this problem, but the matzah tells me I can deal with it. Right? So that's kind of the understanding of Rabbi Gamliel's idea that Pesach, Matzah, Maror are the steps of spiritual liberation. Pesach, community; Matzah, capacity for action; Maror, identifying that which needs to be improved, which needs to be changed. Now, this is something sometimes, people who are already in a religious lifestyle, this is actually a challenge. When one is a choser b'tshuvah, or one is a newcomer, so obviously every step there's always some new growth, right? Shabbos, kosher, etc. Problem is, once you've arrived, once you've become a person who is keeping all of these mitzvot, so then it might become, God forbid, same old, same old. Now the rest of my life I'm just going to kind of just do the same thing over and over again. And that's really a tragic mistake, because life is about growth. Life is about transformation. Life is about making ourselves better. Or to be more accurate, not making ourselves better, but uncovering a goodness that is within, that has not yet been fully realized. So the notion of what is called hitchadshut, the notion of renewal, the notion of growth, is something that applies at every single level. They tell the story, many of you have heard of the German Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, who was a very, very interesting person. He and Martin Buber actually translated the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, into German, and although I don't read German, but Nechama Leibowitz herself testified this was a very, very good translation. And Rosenzweig has an interesting story. Rosenzweig grew up in a totally assimilated German household in the latter quarter of the 19th century, and he was a brilliant student of philosophy. And in those days in Germany, in order to have an academic career, you had to be a member of the Lutheran Church. You didn't have to believe in anything, but you had to sign a card that you were a member of Lutheran and pay some dues. Thousands and thousands of Jews converted to Christianity, but again, it was not it was not because of any type of belief. They just did so because they were so assimilated in their Judaism, even beyond Reform, that they essentially had no religion at all. So they figured they'll sign a card. What's the big deal? Rosenzweig was a person of some greater integrity, and he said before he was going to sign the card, he wanted to walk into a Jewish synagogue once in his life. And his plan was, I'm going to walk into the synagogue, I'll see what I see. It's not going to mean anything to me, I'm pretty sure. Then I'll sign the card, but I need to see what it is. Unbeknownst to him, the day that he chose, seemingly at random, was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He had never heard of Yom Kippur. He had not read the Bible. So, and unbeknownst to him, the one synagogue that he chose, seemingly at random, was the only Hasidic synagogue in Berlin, which had much more emotional power than a standard, let's say, synagogue. So he walks in, expecting to feel nothing, and he's confronted with this tremendous power. People are crying and pleading and begging. And he was overwhelmed with the power and spirituality and a sense of holiness. And he decided that day he was not going to sign the card. He was not going to sign. Eventually he was able to pursue his graduate studies, but for a while he was not able. And he became very devoted to exploring the Jewish tradition. He became pretty traditional and fairly observant. He never became what you might call a totally Orthodox Jew, because he died relatively young of multiple sclerosis. So he did not finish his journey, but he very definitely was a committed Jew. He organized Onik Shabbat, he organized Torah learning groups and Shabbats, etc. So at some point, he was asked by some of his colleagues, his young Jewish colleagues, thought he was just crazy. He had been a brilliant student of philosophy, and now he's engaging in these medieval traditions. He's going over to the dark side, primitive superstition. So one of them gave him what was perceived as the ultimate insult and taunt. I bet you even wear tefillin. Which was like the worst thing you could say to somebody. And he looked the person squarely in the eyes and said, not yet. So Rabbi Tlushkin makes the point that not yet is a very interesting response. He could have said no. No is the answer. He does not wear tefillin. Not yet suggests that my life is still a journey. I'm still growing. No is shutting a door. Not yet is leaving a door open. And Rabbi Tlushkin suggests, and this is a very good suggestion, that every Jew needs to have a not yet in their life, a goal. Finishing Shas, your new goal, right? That's a not yet, and God willing, you will accomplish it. That's why the Siyam Shas was so inspiring. Even people who did not commit to Daf Yomi, they were inspired to commit to various other goals, because they see that if you pursue a goal, you can achieve it. And not yet is actually a great unifier among Jews. You know, we can look at one Jew and say, oh, I'm more religious than him, and he's more religious than me. We can create hierarchies and stratifications. But not yet is an amazingly powerful common denominator. One person might say, well, I'm not yet Shomer Shabbat. Another person could say, I'm not yet totally avoiding Lashon Hara. One person might say, I don't yet study Torah every day. Another person might say, I haven't yet mastered the Jerusalem Talmud. Meaning, the not yet means all of us are on a journey. None of us have arrived. None of us have reached the promised land, even if we're zocheh to be in the geographical promised land. So the fact that one person is further on in the road is ultimately not that important, as long as we all recognize that we're walking on the same road. And that is the really genius and profundity of the not yet statement, because all of us are a not yet. All of us are in the process of Yetzias Mitzrayim. We haven't reached the goal till Mashiach, till Tchiyat HaMesim. But Hashem is giving us this koach to leave the Mitzrayim from within. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu continue to give us the bracha to be able to do so. May we have the wisdom to make the decision to engage in that process. So have a good week.
It's